Okay, so we're doing some rear brakes on my truck, and luckily my good friend and colleague, Mr. Al Hupp, was willing to let me do it in his shop. So he's gonna maybe teach me a few things I didn't know about rear brakes. You never know. Even though I've done it a million times, you always learn something new. And we'll go over a few of the different ideas and procedures that exist as far as brakes are concerned. There's multiple ways you can depress the caliper piston back. One of the ways actually approved by GM is to actually use a C-clamp and depress it before you even take the caliper off. And then on the other side, we'll show you the other methods. So I wanted to replace my rear brakes because they were squeaking really badly. As you can see here, they're really not that low. So one way we can tell for sure is by using a depth gauge. Okay, so if we were in the red here, right, if I just put this in between the rotor and the pad backing, well, that fits. Okay, good. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, that one fits. This one still fits. Of course, this is always better to do with the caliper on if possible. All right, just squeeze these together, make sure we're getting an accurate measurement. Okay, so we're probably right about there. So we're at 5 millimeters. So we're in the yellow, but I mean, realistically, rear brakes, they don't wear as quickly as the front. So I probably had another good, 10, 15,000 miles on these, depending on how I drive. I mean, I drive terrible, so, just teasing. But just to give you an idea, here's a new pad, okay, compared to the old one. So the width of the pad friction material is much more on a new pad than a used pad.
All right, so one thing to mention here, Laura was talking about her brakes squeaking. You need to be able to grab the pads with your fingers and very easily, gently remove it. We're not going to pry on them or beat them off with a hammer, or beat them back in with a hammer. They should be able to move very freely. So when we think about noise, when we say something is squeaking, noise is a vibration. So we need to look at it at that aspect. So something that moves on a floating caliper is the pads need to move freely and the slides need to move freely. As you can see, pads are good, slides good. This slide here is not good. It is frozen, which is very common in the salt areas. So this needs to be addressed. We'll have to take it apart, clean it, see if we can lube it and put it back together. Otherwise it would have to be replaced. So something else we just noticed as we pulled off these pads, this is the inner pad. You can see the circle from the piston. Looks not too bad, but from overheating, you can see there's a crack in the pad. That's not good. That can cause vibration issues. The outer pad, you can see by the 2 marks, this one has multiple cracks in it from getting too hot, most likely from the pin sticking. We pulled the caliper bracket off. This is the bracket. Again, this has the slide pins in it. When you pull these out, there's a pin inside that must move freely. Again, this does not involve hammers, does not involve anything. But as you can see, this one here is completely frozen. We'll have to address that. We're also going to pull off, because this has a drum style parking brake on it. The drum is inside the rotor. Always check these shoes to make sure they're not disintegrated or falling apart due to corrosion and rust.
Yeah, surprisingly, the last time I did rear brakes, I expected to have to replace these, and turns out I didn't. And then 100,000 miles later, so still okay.
Sometimes it's good too to take your fingernail and kind of pull underneath them. Make sure they don't peel off. These are bonded, which means they're glued on. So sometimes from corrosion, you will take your fingernail and pull on them and they will just rip right off.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you just see like little pieces, little chunks just kind of falling around in there. That creates a lot of noise, sometimes depending. But usually it's pretty quiet and you don't notice it unless you go to use your parking brake, and it just doesn't work as well for safety inspection.
One thing we didn't mention earlier is make sure as you're taking the caliper off the vehicle, you're using some sort of hook to hang it so that you're not dropping the caliper and stretching the brake hoses.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, Al, so what do you think? Like, Should we sand off the axle flange here?
Yes, you
or
can.
Does this look okay? Or
It's
what?
not terrible. We can get a wire brush, clean this up a little bit just to make sure we don't get any run out in the rotor from having corrosion on this flange. As you can see on the new rotor, it's nice and clean. This has a powder coated surface, which I like. I'm a little OCD when it comes to, I don't like rust on my vehicle, so I buy rotors that tend to have some sort of coating on them, especially in our rusty environment we have here in Virginia.
Definitely. So, like, basically, when we were talking about run out, we're talking about, you know, normally, the rotor's going to be, okay. So we want the rotor to be nice and straight on there, okay? And if we have a little bit of rust buildup on one section or another, what's going to happen is, instead of being nice and straight, it's one end is going to kind of be sticking out, okay? This is an exaggeration, of course, but you can imagine that if your brake caliper is trying to grab onto this, and it's kind of like rotating around like this, then it's not going to be able to really do that well, and you're going to end up with what's called a brake pulsation. And any kind of vibration is generally really bad because it'll end up shaking the whole car, and any kind of mounts you have, suspension components are going to be at risk. So let's clean it up.
So this is just a wire brush on a die grinder, nothing special. This one's a little bit wore out, but this is what I had in hand.
Bam. Looking beautiful. I don't have to even dust it off. I don't know why I'm doing this. Just habit. So here we go. Okay, so sometimes on some cars, like you'll see there's these little screw holes, and that's basically just to help you pull a really rusty rotor off. So you'll stick a threaded bolt in there, and it acts like a press. So the more you stick the threaded bolt in there, the more it presses up against the flange, and the more it presses up against the flange, the more it pulls the rotor off, okay? But yeah, there's no like situation where we have holes in the flange where we want to make sure that we're not lining this up with the hole, because then you wouldn't be able to use it. There would be no place to press up against if that was the case. So we can just slide it on.
Okay, so something else to mention, because this has the drum style parking brake, as you can see here, it's very loose, very easy to move. We also need to adjust right here is a parking brake shoe adjuster. We need to adjust this up so that we have a good quality parking brake when we're finished.
But Al, it seemed fine when I brought it in today.
Yeah.
Why should I adjust it now? Do I always have to adjust it and check for that?
Yes, because every aftermarket rotor, this diameter could be a different size than a factory GM or AC Delco rotor. So you can see I put about 6 or 8 turns on it, and it's still doing absolutely nothing. So we're going to turn it some more, get a little bit of drag on it, so that Laura will have a good parking brake. So you probably can't hear it in the video, but you can hear a slight drag. That's all we're looking for, a little bit of resistance.
Sweet. Well, bam. All right, so now I'm going to put the caliper back on. One thing that I'm kind of like a stickler about is I don't want the rotor to be sagging one way or the other. So I like to put just like, typically, I like to put lug nuts on here and here. But I mean, it seems to be doing okay. So I'm not really too worried about it. Usually doing that just helps to keep the rotor nice and straight, nice and flush up against the hub. And when that happens, it's a whole lot easier to get the caliper bracket and the caliper back on.
All right, so this was the caliper bracket that was frozen. This was the one that was good. Take a pair of pliers, put it on here. Yeah, I already freed this up some, but give it a good twist. pull it out, and you'll see there's a lot of debris on here. As you can see, I'm not a glove fan. Some people are, some people aren't. I use opinions on that one. But
Sometimes
we're gonna take a little
really
bit of a brake clean here. We're gonna wash the pin off a little. I usually will spray up inside the caliper bracket, try to rinse out some of that nasty grease. A lot of times what causes this is people using the wrong grease on the calipers. Make sure you're using synthetic caliper grease. This is the pin that was frozen a minute ago, so now it moves nice and free, and you can see it's still dirty. Just depends how much time you want to spend cleaning it. But now that it moves freely, just like the other one, I'm gonna grab some caliper grease, we'll grease it up, and get it ready to go back on.
Okay, Al, so what if the slide doesn't come out that easily? What do you do then?
Oh, there's multiple ways you can try to get it out. In our field, time is money, so most people are going to replace the caliper bracket or the entire caliper assembly. You can take like an electric heat gun, heat it up a little bit, spray some PB Blaster, WD-40, whatever flavor you have laying around, and try to get it freed up. Sometimes it's just not worth the time to try to get it. It is easier to replace it with a different model. It just depends, you know, again, we get paid by the hour, so it depends how much time you want to spend. If it's your own vehicle, you may want to spend more time doing it. But like I said, you can see all my stuff is well used around here, but this is synthetic disc brake caliper grease. Does not wash off with water, so all you're going to do is pull it off, wipe them clean, put a little bit of grease on there. And this does not have to be a clean job, doesn't matter. Make sure it's moving in and out freely. The other thing to also verify is that the boot is locked on correctly. Toyotas have a big problem with this. If you don't get the boots locked on, the caliper will be froze up in about 3 months because it gets dirt into the grease all day long. So, yeah, make sure you pull it out, put plenty of grease on it, put it back in, make sure the boot is locked on, and moves nice and freely in return.
Sometimes these get like nice big air pockets behind them too, and then it just doesn't even want to compress. And you have to make sure you push this in when you're sliding the caliper on top. We'll show you that in a minute. But what about the torch? I've seen some people use a torch on this.
I would not use a torch on this because it's a safety item. You will change the hardness of the bracket. By doing that, it would not be safe. And again, it is not worth the time to heat them up. If you were in an emergency situation where something had to get fixed and you had no way to get parts, maybe, but I don't recommend it, you know. That's what we like to refer to as a bush fix. If you're in the middle of nowhere, stuck on a four-wheel drive trail trying to fix the car for an emergency, but you know, generally we don't have too many of those, so we try to do it correctly by not taking shortcuts and not heating up the bracket. Again, this is just a hollow tube inside, so if you get too much corrosion in it, you're just going to spend too much time trying to get it cleaned out. I've also seen people drill holes in them to try to spray lube in here to get the fluid down in there and then heat them up. I do not recommend that. They can crack and break, and you're trying to rely on stopping Laura's 200-pound vehicle with a 4 calipers, so it's not great. That
would be a problem. So I really like how you mentioned synthetic brake lube. So what about like anti-seize?
Nope.
You just use anti-seize?
No anti-seize. For anti-seize, after it sits for a while, anti-seize becomes this gummy, horrible product. It's good for bolts, not good for sensors, not good for brakes. So make sure you're looking at the product and make sure you're using it for what it's intended for. Anti-seize is also not compatible. A lot of these slides will have a little rubber ring in here. It's a design, just a different design than this. It will cause the ring to swell up and then they freeze up for sure. So don't use the incorrect products.
So I have this Napa brake parts lube, and it says contains silicone. It says it's for brake parts. How do you know if this is good or not good?
As long as it says it's for brake components, it should be fine. Like I said, this one's the same thing, right in the description.
Yep.
Maybe we'll get sponsored by Permatex for
Yep,
a video.
Permatex
maybe
or Napa.
Yeah.
I mean, either one,
We
right?
need a hookup.
This one's clear. That one's green. Green matches our Nova colors.
Yeah.
Come on, Napa, get on board. Okay.
We can even throw CarQuest in the mix here. You know?
Yeah. We use all brands, all manufacturers in here. Okay. Awesome. Well, you think this is ready to go back on?
I think it is.
What else? What about, the rust over here? You said you don't like rust. Should we clean this off too while we have it on the...
Yeah, we could take the wire brush, this little area right in here where the clips go for the brake pads. It will get rust on it. If you get an excessive amount of rust, you may have to take sandpaper and or a file and actually run through here and clean this up. If rust grows, it's going to expand and cause the brake pads to fit too tight. If they fit too tight, we'll have too tight of a fit and excessive wear and or squeaking on the brake pads, and nobody wants to hear their brake pads squeak.
Yeah, so the brake pads I got, and usually, good quality brake pads, they'll come with replacement clips. So This is kind of what we're talking about.
So this is the old clip. You can see it's not in too bad a shape. It has a little bit of wear and tear from where the brake pad sits on it. They put these on there, again, so it doesn't rust and it gives it a wear surface. So if it wears out, you can replace it. The new clip, not much different. Like I said, the biggest thing is just making sure these are clean. Laura's are actually pretty clean in here, so I wouldn't mess with them too much.
I wire brush the heck out of them every time.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Well, there you go. So she keeps them clean. She doesn't wash her car, she cleans it with a wire brush.
I mean, some things are more important, like brakes and stopping power. Okay.
Yeah, especially in Northern Virginia where we go from 80 to 0 constantly.
Yes, I'm a 95er along with everyone else.
Yep.
Okay, so, and I've seen, people do, a lot of different things. I've seen a lot of people actually put, some of this same brake lube that we use for the slides on the caliper underneath of the clips. And, some people do that just because they want to prevent rust. I kind of feel like that's a little overkill, and I sort of don't want it to slip off because these clip in there just, kind of like so. And it's held in by spring tension, and I sort of don't want them to move around too much. So I'm okay, personally me, with not doing that. And there's also a couple different of other methods as far as putting grease on these actual slides too.
Yeah, so I have students ask me about this all the time. I have a lot of people who prefer to do this. They will pull this clip out, they'll put some grease, synthetic grease, under here, and they'll also put it right here where the brake pads ride. It is an opinion thing. From the factory, no manufacturer puts brake grease here or here, okay? It is just the way it's designed. They say it's not necessary. So my opinion, if the manufacturer doesn't do it, I don't do it. So, they spend millions of dollars engineering these cars, and we don't want to spend 5 minutes and mess them up. The other thing that happens, if I take this grease and I put it on my finger and I go drive down a dusty road, it's going to attract dirt. So if I put grease on here and go drive down a dusty, dirty road, it's gonna make it actually stick worse over time. Not right away, but down the road it will. So when Laura was talking about a wire brush, I also have a different style wire brush I use to clean these. So we'll come in here with this.
The Big Daddy wire brush.
Yeah.
That's what people are saying at home.
It takes a few seconds to end up with a better product when we're done with our job. So sometimes it's better to spend a few seconds now than get a comeback later and have the customer come back and complain about the brake squeaking.
All right. So basically we can put these clips on now, right? And so you're saying no lube.
I do not use it. It is your vehicle, so you can use your opinion on how you would like to do it.
Well,
I don't agree with it. I just don't think it's necessary.
Well, since I'm your special guest, I will do what you recommend, because this is your shop, and you are technically the professional in this environment. So I'm gonna try it out, and guess what? I'll be back if it doesn't work, right? Like all of the other people that come to you.
That's it.
Okay.
Exactly. Everybody comes back with complaints. Huh?
Yeah, whether they're legitimate or not, it's just something we have to deal with. Okay, so, just since this is kind of easy to see right here, I guess we can do a little demonstration. So for some people who do want to use lube, or if the manufacturer for some reason does recommend using lube here.
And something else to mention is we're not using AC Delco parts. These are not factory GM pads, okay? These are probably half the cost, which a lot of customers are like, yeah, I don't want to spend $130 on a set of pads. I'd rather spend $60. Nothing wrong with that. This brand here is Centric, so we can get a sponsorship by Centric as well.
Ooh, yes.
RockAuto.com. But these are good pads. If they come with instructions the first time you use these, please read the instructions on a new product at least one time. Sometimes they will recommend things. Some factory brake pads have shims on them, and the aftermarket pads will tell you not to put the shims back on, the factory shims. Hondas are famous for that. So if they have 4 levels of shims, you need to know whether or not to put them back on. So please read the instructions at least one time with a new product, okay? I know we don't like to read instructions, but it's life.
Instructions, but it's nuts and bolts, Al.
Yeah,
it's just nuts and bolts. You just take it apart and put it back together.
Yep. So also when you're putting these new pads in, these pads are gonna ride in here in these grooves. Make sure you set them in here. Make sure they slide in freely, and then I can move them in and out with my fingers. All right, so as long as I can move them freely, it will be good to go to not cause any issues after we put it back together.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some people like actually set up the brake caliper bracket just like this and then stick it on the car.
Yep.
I kind of have a tendency to put the caliper bracket on first and then, but it doesn't really matter. There's like,
and if it was necessary, if it fit too tight, like we went to put it in here and we're like, oh, this thing really won't go in, we could take a file and actually file these down a little bit. I don't know if you can kind of see in the camera, sometimes you'll get a little bit of manufacturer flashing on here where it's not quite perfect. And sometimes we'll just have to take a file. It makes a huge difference in the outcome of your brake job.
Yeah, I mean, I think, working at the Ford dealer, we had a lot of, I think it was Expeditions that had that same issue. And generally what happened was you couldn't really tell. It was hard to see, but there was actually some rust that was being created underneath of these shims. And you could really only tell that it was rust because the metal was slightly discolored. It wasn't even like the typical red rust that you see. So
and the other thing to look at is to make sure that when you're taking it out, look to see that your brake pads are even left to right. They should be pretty close. If this brake pad is completely wore out and this one's brand new, that's an indication of a problem. So then you need to try to figure out, is it the slides, is it the pad is frozen, or is it the actual caliper that's sticking? If you had one wore out pad, it would not be a caliper sticking, because a caliper squeezes, it squeezes both brake pads. If the caliper was stuck, it would wear both out. Okay, so if you look at the left side and the right side, one side's wore out, one side's not, there's a good possibility you do have a sticking caliper. Like this one where this, I think it was this one, the upper, this is upside down right this second. Right. The upper here was sticking. So that means when the caliper squeezes, this can't release afterwards. So what it's gonna do is wear these pads down a little bit more than the other side because they're dragging all the time.
Yeah, so basically it can squeeze, but it doesn't really release. It's just the brake pads are kind of always hanging out, riding on that rotor, just kind of scraping.
Causing squeaking.
Yeah, exactly. So also, that's really important to mention, like making sure that these slide in and out freely. It's called clearancing the pads. That's what my mentor used to say, which, you work for the same dude, small world in automotive.
Yep.
And then also, we have our little squealer right here, our little sensor, whatever you want to call it.
Brake pad indicator?
It's indicator. I mean, some people call it a sensor. It's not really a sensor, unless it's BMW, in which case they do have a wire attached to this, and that would be a sensor because it's electrical. But yeah, little squealer, brake pad indicator, whatever. So basically, as this pad wears down, once it wears down to the point where this thing is touching the rotor, it's going to make a nice squealing sound for you.
Yes, for about 2 days, and then it will break off.
Yep.
And the people are usually like, hey, I had this noise, it went away, and now all of a sudden all I hear is grinding. It's like, well, you went past the indicator and you went all the way to the metal part of the brake pad, and here we are.
Yeah, that does happen. Okay, so where should this thing go? Where should that little indicator go?
The indicator is typically going to be at the bottom of the caliper. So on this one, I got to think, I'm out of screen now, sorry. But normally what it's going to do is as the rotor's coming around, it's going to vibrate. So you want it to come down and vibrate off of the backside of it. It usually doesn't make a lot of difference, but again, it's just what's recommended.
Yeah, usually it's the bottom inside corner.
Yep.
And for whatever reason, I find that sometimes the bottom inside corner wears faster than the other parts.
Yeah, the inside of a caliper, if it's a single piston caliper, the inside pad will always wear more than the outside. It's just the design of the caliper and the brake system itself. So it will always wear more on the inside than the outside. It's just life.
So general rule, as long as it's on the inside, you're probably
tiny bit more.
Probably doing a little bit better job.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Well, that was a lot of talk.
Yep.
Not a whole lot of action, right?
Yep.
There's a lot more to that than what meets the eye. So I guess we can stick it on the car now. Okay, so I'm just gonna pop this baby on. We've got no lube to worry about. So one of the other nice things about not using caliper slide grease on the actual pad slides is that we don't have to worry about getting grease all over the rotor as we put this on. So little plus side there. These bolts, they come with yellow Loctite from the factory. If you look at the GM specific instructions, they say to use red Loctite. So I'll probably use just a little bit of red Loctite. We don't want to overdo it. We're not going to be crazy with it, but I'll use a little bit on there just to follow the procedure. Okay. Get this set up. Because I just don't have any other place to put this down. So I can go grab my Loctite. Then I'll
so one of the other
reset.
things to mention while Laura's doing that is this surface here, you want to try to touch it as least as possible. You don't want greasy fingerprints all over the surface. If you do not clean them off before you drive it, as soon as you rotate it, it's going to contaminate the brake pads. Number one, it's going to smoke. So if you don't drive it enough, the customer's going to complain about smell or smoke. The other thing is it will soften the brake pads. So we don't want to soften the brake pads and cause issues there. Mm-hmm. So if you get this all greasy with fingerprints, please clean it off.
Yes, brakes work off of friction, which dissipates heat, and that's how we can stop the car. And if there's no friction, you cannot dissipate heat, and you're not stopping the car. So grease is an oil is there to reduce friction, not add to it. So yeah, I mean, one of the things you can see on here, maybe, let's see, okay, is there's actually a lot of buildup on these threads, and that's from using Loctite so many times over the years. And I mean, this truck has 240,000 miles on it now, so I've had to do brakes on this a number of times. This part is boring. I'll probably just speed this part up.
All right, Laura, so how many miles does the average person get out of a set of brakes?
Oh, that's an excellent question.
Average. We'll use the word average.
I don't know. Well, there's me, and then there's that. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so average, you know, we always used to say average about 30,000 miles for the front, and somewhere in the 50 to 60 neighborhood for the rear. And that's because most of your braking, like 60 to 70% of it is done in the front, so they're going to wear down faster. But if you're talking like a hybrid or something like that, where the brakes aren't really doing the majority of the braking, it's the regenerative braking system, which has nothing to do with the brakes, then you can be going like 100,000 miles without ever
Yeah, I'll
replacing
tell
the
you,
brakes.
on average on hybrids, my experience, I see about 125,000 miles before they have to be replaced. And usually they do have to be serviced so that we don't get the pads sticking, the slides sticking. We will have to take them apart, clean them up, free them up, and make sure everything's working right before they actually have to be replaced. And just because they're sticking does not mean they have to be replaced. If the pads look good, the rotors look good, we could take the rust off of here, free up these, put some new grease on them, send it down the road. It's not necessary to replace everything every time.
So I'm a weakling, Al.
Yes, ma'am.
Should we get a torque stick to make sure?
No, not a torque stick, a torque wrench.
Oh, a torque wrench. There's a difference?
Yes, torque sticks are trash. They should never be used on anything.
Okay.
And so everyone aware is Ugga Dugga is not a torque spec. Yes, a lot of students like to use the impact and they call it the Ugga Dugga method. That is not correct. So we do need to probably look up the torque spec. On this one, I do believe it's probably somewhere around 80 pounds. But yes, we need to look up the torque spec. These bolts, when you're looking up the torque specs, be cautious. This bolt on the backside is double the size. In fact, if you can grab that bolt right out there on the running board.
Yeah, okay, let's do that.
Let's do this. So you saw the other bolt, right? This bolt here is an 18 millimeter head, which is probably equivalent to a 10 millimeter bolt. This bolt here is a 13 millimeter head, which is equivalent to about an 8 millimeter bolt. They do not have the same torque spec. I run into this every semester that someone looks up the torque spec for this bolt and they try to use the torque spec on this bolt.
So big bolt, bigger torque.
Yep, little bolt, little torque.
Okay.
So this bolt here is usually somewhere around 25 to 30 foot-pounds. This one here is usually between 75 and about 90 foot-pounds. So do not try to put 90 foot-pounds on this bolt. It will break every time, especially on imports. They use a different type of thread on their bolts and they break very easily.
And harder to get those bolts too as a replacement.
Yes, so I know students broke the ones on my Camry.
Oh.
Car, we were trying to free up a slide problem. Car only had 50,000 miles on it. The problem is Advance and AutoZone and CarQuest, and nobody had them in stock. And you have to buy this whole thing as a unit. And if they don't have it in stock, you can't drive home. So I now have a extra set at the college. I usually keep them for emergencies. It happens.
Well, that is really nice of you, Al. Awesome.
So
Okay.
we'll go look up these torque specs and get back with you.
Awesome. There's also this dust seal right around the piston, and I don't want to tear that up. You know, I'm really not interested in replacing a caliper today. So you ruin that, and you're basically, well, that's it. You really should get a new one because it will lock up on you eventually.
Yes, and the other point too is to always look at this to make sure it's not cracked and destroyed. And Laura's looks pretty good. When it's cracked and destroyed, that's usually a sign that it's been overheating and that it just has disintegrated the seal and should be replaced. The calipers can be rebuilt, but it is a lot of work. And again, we are time-based people, so generally we do not do that. If you want to do it for your own vehicle, that's great, but time is money, money is time.
Absolutely. Okay.
And I don't know that your boss would like it too much if he saw you rebuilding calipers on the club.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. We're just not going to do that. Okay.
So something else you see Laura doing is making sure you do not twist the brake hose. If you twist the brake hose, it can cause weird conditions. It can cause the brakes to pull. It can cause the lines to blow as well from excess pressure in the system.
Okay. So, yep, we're going to have to use the other tool now. Al, also, do you have a rag? Because now
Yes.
my fingers are nice and greasy, and the last thing I want to do is, like, get grease all over this. Okay. Yeah, I won't rust. That's great. Okay, so earlier I showed you that, you know, the GM method is to use the C-clamp and actually start pressing on the old pad, okay, to depress this piston here. Because, yeah, with that square cut seal, that piston does end up kind of traveling outwards slowly over time. And so now that we have brand new brake pads, we need to push this piston all the way back so that we have room to fit these nice big meaty pads back in. So
Two different styles. So
yep.
this is considered to be a dual piston compressor. So if you have multiple pistons, it will even do 4 piston. We also have the old style. These are very cheap to purchase. They cost about $6. With this one here, if you were going to use it, you have to make sure you put your pad back in. You do not want to push directly against the piston. Some of them are plastic. If you push against the plastic piston, it will crack or break.
Yeah, so that's kind of generally how that looks, and you know, just about every kind of press tool or anything like that is going to involve a screw and pushing up against something.
And if you have a C-clamp and that works for you, make sure you put the pad in there to push against it. That's okay. Like I said, this tool here, I think that one I bought 25 years ago, still works. Cost about $7 or $10. This one here cost about $50 from Matco.
And let me go ahead and show you why you want to use an old pad. Hold that, please, sir. Okay, so as you noticed, hopefully, right, we put this in the caliper, and then this is the piece that's pushing up against the pad. If you used a new pad, then obviously we're gonna create a nice little dent in there. Yeah, so this dent is perfectly fine for this old pad because we're gonna throw it away anyway, no big deal. But you definitely don't want to stick like a new pad in there, because let's say you already threw the old pads away, you're in the shop, the trash dude comes around and picks up all the trash, and then you're like, oh, I don't know what to do. Okay, use anything but the new pad. Okay, so yeah, that did a fine job of pushing that back in. I don't want to get Al's other tool all greasy, but the other one works sort of like a ratchet. This will do a little demonstration. So, and you can actually reverse it too. Oh, fancy. So as you rotate it, this is actually making it contract, okay, which you may have to do depending on the size of the caliper and everything like that. And then you can switch it around, and now it'll expand. So I'll just kind of
And I will warn you, this is a cool tool, does not fit every vehicle.
Oh, and probably a little more expensive, huh? Excellent, so we got that all taken care of. So now that I've fully depressed my caliper piston, because using the C-clamp method in the beginning didn't quite get it compressed enough to account for these nice new pads. So I'll go ahead and slap this on. And you know, a lot of people get frustrated when putting calipers back on because they're like, why doesn't it go on? Well, one of the reasons is actually these nice caliper slide pins, because as you can see, there's a lot of air behind these. So sometimes I like to just squeeze them a little bit and make sure all the air is out. Okay, push that in. Because basically when there's air in there, it'll force this out, and then you're not going to be able to get the caliper back on. Okay, so. And sometimes you can use the caliper to actually squeeze those slide pins back in as well. Okay, there we go. So it's a little finagling sometimes. Usually it's pretty easy, but there are some cars out there where you're just like, why doesn't this go on? Just be patient, make sure you're pushing in your pins, and you know, all this is hand tool stuff, okay? So no air tools, no power tools required on this. Yeah, I was just telling Al how I use my running boards more for a tool support while doing work.
It's easy, you don't lose your parts that way.
You know what? Yeah, one place you don't want to put your tools on the car is the cowl under the hood, because a lot of times you'll shut the hood, you'll drive, the customer will drive away, and that's it. That's the end of your tools.
And they got a free tool.
And they got a free tool.
The other thing to remember is like this caliper S-hook that I have here. This is actually a cheap tool. This is from Lowe's. It's a shower curtain hook. Cost about $2.
Look at that.
Don't leave it hanging on the frame and drive off down the road. I've lost plenty of them doing that.
And that's why you get them for $2.
Yes.
Okay. Another thing is, if you feel like you might lose something or you've lost something a lot, you can wrap it up in some yellow tape. Hopefully that will help prevent any kind of issues. So I'm going to put just, excuse me, a little bit of Loctite on the caliper bolts. Not the caliper bracket, but the caliper bolts, okay? Just a little bit. I really like to do that. Well, one, GM says to do it, but number two is because this caliper is actually aluminum, and the caliper bracket is metal. Not just metal, but like a cast iron type of metal. So two very different metals, that's where I was getting. And so they're gonna expand and contract at different rates. And so since aluminum is gonna expand like almost twice as much as this caliper bracket, that's cast iron, I want to make sure that this bolt stays in there and doesn't kind of get pushed out over time, especially since I don't plan on having to replace these again for a very long time. I mean, hopefully 60,000 miles. Seems like I can't ever go that long just from being on 95 so much. But that is the goal, to not have to replace these for, let's say, at least 40,000 miles. That might be a little bit more reasonable of a goal. Okay, so I wanted to kind of get a close-up of this. So you'll see that there's the caliper slide pin, and you can actually put a wrench on top of that, okay, to hold it in place, because the caliper bolt is going to actually thread into the caliper slide pin. So that way, you know, this caliper floats or moves, okay, independent of the caliper bracket, because the caliper bracket stays still. This part is supposed to move back and forth. You can kind of see it has some movement, not just because it's loose here, but that's how it's supposed to be. So we want to hold one side, oops, sorry, and then tighten the other, okay? Because otherwise, if you just try to tighten this, then you can see that this caliper slide pin just spins and spins and spins. So you'll see this kind of arrangement on a lot of different things on cars, where you have to hold one thing and, okay, I'll just snug that up for now. Of course, I gotta go get the torque spec and torque it as well. All right, so this is a digital torque wrench. So I've got it set to, a little tough to see, but 28 pounds-feet, not technically foot-pounds, but whatever, okay? And so the way you use this is you basically just turn it on. Now it's already set to 28, but obviously you can adjust it up and down. And the digital torque wrenches are really nice. Thank you, Al, for letting me use it. Also, make sure you're going on or tightening, because it should give you a nice beep when you've reached the proper torque. Yep, that's it. Okay, so as soon as it beeps, you stop turning. Don't keep going. It will not prevent you from over torquing. And then, of course, at the end, it tells you how much you actually did torque, if you did over torque. So I over torqued by 0.9 pounds-feet. So that's okay. I'm going to just go with that. I think it'll be all right. So I'll do the same for the bottom, and then just finish up the other side. Okay, so big tires are the enemy of technician backs. So I just wanted to show you a couple methods to get some big tires up on vehicles without hurting yourself. So one method is the roll-up method. Back up here so you can see, all right? Which is literally just roll the tire up on your bed, flip it around, and mount, okay? The other method is gonna be the flip method. So you turn the face of the wheel out, okay, away from you, and then grab the spokes, like so, bend your knees, use your knees for leverage, and lift. Usually you do this much closer to the car so you don't have to walk over with it, but you can. All right, so one last thing before we let the customer take the vehicle is to pump the brake pedal. So you want to make sure that you pump the brakes before you start it. All right. Make sure you have a good, strong pedal. Excellent. And that way you won't put the vehicle in reverse and then accidentally drive out of the bay with no brakes. Therefore, if you have no brakes, then you can go, but you can't stop. So just be sure to, again, pump that brake pedal. All right, well, that concludes this episode. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Lauren,
Thanks,
is your car
Al.
stopping? Goodbye.
Thanks, Al. See you at school.
Yep, thank you.